I preached, or taught would be a better word. I taught a whole series on prayer. In fact, we had a whole theme on prayer just a couple years ago. On Sunday nights, we put together prayer journals. We emphasized prayer. We did a lot of specific teaching on prayer for several Sunday nights. But for the next few Sunday mornings, I want to preach a series on prayer. I'm going to talk today by talking about a man of prayer, and that is a biblical example we have in Daniel. That'll be our context this morning. Next week, I want to talk about the house of prayer. When Jesus Christ walked into the temple and saw the money changers, we saw something in Jesus we seldom see in his 3.5-year ministry, and that is he got really angry. You think of all the accusations that happened to him, and all the things that were thrown at him, and all the criticism that he was under. But he got mad, and he kept quiet, and he didn't deal with those things, but he got mad the day he walked into the temple and saw the money changers. And the Bible says he turned over their tables. And he quoted from Isaiah. And I say quoted from Isaiah, but John tells us that in the beginning was the Word. The Word with God, the Word was God. So that means Jesus was quoting himself in Isaiah when he says, "Do you not know that my house is a house of prayer?" He called the temple a house of prayer. I think we see in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, that the New Testament church was founded as a place of prayer. The Bible tells us they prayed and the place was shaken. And so emphasis at church should be one of our emphasis, for sure, should be on prayer. So we're going to talk about that. I think that's really where my heart was as I was putting this series together, is the importance of prayer within the church family. Not just devotionally. We're going to see that in the life of Daniel. But as a church, what a difference we could make in our community, in our world, if the church was really a house of prayer. I want to talk about the God who answers prayer. Not just, I'm going to say this, you'll hear it again when I preach that message, but so often I believe we put faith in the fact that we prayed. Well, I prayed about it. Well, pardon my French, but whoop-de-doo, you know. Let's talk about the fact that we're going before the throne of the Almighty God who hears and answers prayer. We should have much more confidence in the God that we're talking to, and not the guy who's making the prayer. You know, we have much more confidence in the fact that God on the other end hears us and responds to us and wants what's best for us. Who are we talking to? So the God who answers prayer. And then number 4 there, the faith necessary in prayer. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. So we want to talk about faith. Again, not just going through the motions of prayer. Not just using prayer like a good luck charm, but that the faith that's necessary. And then the model prayer. The disciples came to Jesus Christ and said, "Lord, teach us to pray." And so the Lord gave a model prayer. We call it the Lord's Prayer. So often we use it as in churches reciting the Lord's Prayer, but the Lord gave it as a model prayer. He said, pray in this manner. Here's an outline of what to pray for. We're going to look at that outline that he gave us. And so those are my next 5 messages I want to preach. If I don't go in that order, forgive me. But those are the next 5 messages we're going to look at, not necessarily in the order that they're on the screen right there. Today, I want to start with number 1, and that is Daniel, a man of prayer. A man who I think exemplifies prayer as maybe no one else in Scripture, and I hope we see that today. I was talking to Brother Walker after Sunday school about sometimes we have so much information to pack into so little time. And if we're going to look at Daniel's prayer life, well, the entire book of Daniel is Daniel's prayer life. There's so much information. So we're going to try to condense it into one message today as we look at the example that Daniel gives us, set a precedent of how to get a hold of God, how to pray. And listen, I think Daniel's important to us for this reason. Ready? He was not in the greatest of environments. The place he was, the conditions of his day. Daniel didn't have a strong church family. And I understand Old Testament, he's before church age. So, okay, Daniel didn't have a strong synagogue family. He didn't have a temple to go to, right? He didn't have those things. Where was his prayer group? Who were his peers that were helping him? We don't have too many. We have a couple listed earlier in his life, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, but we don't see them the rest of the book. For whatever reason. They were moved, relocated, they passed away, I don't know. So Daniel, on his own, got a hold of God. So we're going to look at Daniel's prayer life today. I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 2. I think I already mentioned that. And I put up here, listen, I don't want to be flipping through slides. That's my entire outline today. We're going to look at that. I'm not going to flip anymore. That's it. That's my outline today. If you want to write it down, there it is. But we're going to look at Daniel's prayer life. We're going to start with a program of prayer. And so we're going to look at a pattern. So this is the first thing we're going to do today, a little different. We're going to take the book of Daniel, and we're going to go through it, kind of chapter by chapter, real quick, highlight some verses as we look at his prayer life. Then I'm going to go back to Daniel chapter 6 and expound upon that particular story. Anybody know what happens in Daniel chapter 6? Lion's den. Daniel in the lion's den. We're going to look at Daniel in the lion's den as our key story. And we're not talking about his time in the lion's den, and we're not talking about lions. We're going to talk about his prayer life and what led to that predicament that he ended up in and the situation he ended up in. But we're going to get to that at the end. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to put on my glasses as I read through some of these. And again, we're going to jump through some passages of Scripture. Daniel 1, they show up, right? They get taken from their homeland. They get taken down to Babylon. They will not eat of the king's meat. They prove the fact that God is with them. We see that all in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. We see those four. In Daniel chapter 2, we begin with the crux of Daniel in the midst of the life where he is now in Babylon and the interaction he has at the highest levels of this important empire of the time. Chapter 2, verse number 16, I'm going to read a verse and we'll talk about it. Daniel went in, desired of the king that he would give him time, that he would show the king the interpretation. So just, again, because of time, I'm going to consolidate, but this begins with Nebuchadnezzar having a dream, being very distraught about the dream, calling in all of his magicians and wise men the next day, and saying, listen, I'm really troubled by my dream. So here's what I need to know. I don't really remember my dream. And I want to know what it means. And his wise men, his counselors and stuff say, well, you tell us what it is, we'll tell you what it means. And Nebuchadnezzar says, no, I don't really remember it. I just know I'm really bothered by it, so you got to tell me the dream first. If you can't, then you guys are worthless to me, and I'm going to have you all killed. Daniel's new on the scene. He's not established yet. And as we come to verse number 16, they have come to arrest him, to take him away to be killed. And again, he's just new here. He's the new guy here. And he says, give me a minute. I'll go in and interpret the dream for the king. Verse 17, Daniel went to his house. He made this thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Let's stop right there for a second. So Daniel said, Lord, here's an opportunity for you to be glorified. Reveal the dream and the interpretation that I may tell the king. It'll save all these other guys' lives, but more importantly, it'll show who you are. And he comes before the God of heaven to ask for wisdom in this matter. Verse number 20 then, through I think it's verse 23, Daniel then praises God. And so we see Daniel with a praise. And we're going to talk about that. Verse 20, Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for his wisdom and might are his. He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. So he comes before God and he prays. We don't know how long the prayer was. We don't know what all he said. That's not captured here. But he comes before the God of heaven and says, God, give us an answer that we may go in before the king and you'll be glorified. What we do have captured for us is his thank you, his praise. One of the things we're going to look at over these next 5 Sundays is the importance of praising God, honoring God for who he is, and thanking him for what he has done. And Daniel takes the time to do that. In other words, I think one of the things that we are guilty of is we ask, and then give a quick thank you. Boom. And if anything, we may see the opposite here. We don't know how long or how much or how extensively he asked, but we do know here's a pretty thorough thank you. He honored God for who he was and thanked him specifically for this answer to prayer. Then he goes into the king. Then he reveals all the dream, the interpretation, all that. And you jump down to verse 47. 47, I'm getting to the end of that story. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is, you're a really wise man. No. That's not what the king said. Who got the glory in this situation? The king, sitting on the throne, said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Listen, God received the glory in the situation, even from the ungodly king. In the midst of this, as Daniel got this secret, listen, it could have elevated Daniel because he just saved the life of a lot of really important men in Babylon. That could have done wonders for his career. But that wasn't the crux of this. That happened, but the crux of this is as he gave Nebuchadnezzar the answer, Daniel gave glory to God, and at the end of it, Nebuchadnezzar said, your God is the God of all gods. That was proclaimed from the throne of the most important empire at that time. That was the words that were uttered. That was the response that was given as Nebuchadnezzar, the mightiest man alive at that time, said, your God, that God that you serve, that's the true God. Wow, that's a profound statement. Think about that coming, from the White House today. Think about that coming from the heads of state around our country today. That would make news. That would be something. Nebuchadnezzar, the most important leader, king of the most important empire of his time, proclaimed that Daniel's God, that's the true God. This is a culture that had many gods, that worshiped many gods. They didn't want to miss anything, so they worshiped everything. And that was kind of their mindset is, we don't know for sure, so we're just going to have a God for everything, small g, God for everything. But at the end of this conversation, Nebuchadnezzar said, that's it. You have the one and only true God. Listen, that's not the only time that's going to happen in Daniel's life. It's going to happen several times in Daniel's life. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Chapter 5, we have the handwriting on the wall. Chapter 5, look at verse 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And we see in verse 6, his countenance was changed, his thoughts were troubled, his joints of his loins were loosed, his knees smote one against the other. Do you find that interesting, verse number 6? We use that phrase today. So scared that your knees knock. That's a biblical wording. And here in verse number 6, it says that the king, Belshazzar, that the king was so scared his knees knocked together. He was terrified of what he just saw. Verse number 9, then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, his countenance changed, his lords were astonished, all of his co-workers there. Verse 10, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. The queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Why? Verse 11, there's a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, notice all the small g's, all this was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father made him master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. I'm going to stop right there. Belshazzar has no idea what's going on. He's terrified at this writing upon the wall. He can make out the hand of what looks like a man writing on the wall over above the candlestick where it could be clearly seen. It terrifies him. He doesn't know what to do. The queen brings some calm to the situation when she says to him, well, there is a guy that your dad had called Daniel. You should call him. Now, again, let's look at the situation of Daniel's life. Daniel is taken as a young man into captivity, drug away from his home, away from his countrymen, away from his people, away from his language, taken into Babylon, expected to be now a wise man, a counselor, a leader in the Babylonian Empire. He gets moved up very quickly because of the dream that he interprets for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar makes him, it says, he's head of the captains over Babylon. He's a very influential man. But that was during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar comes along, and Belshazzar doesn't even know who he is. His wife knows, the queen knows. The queen says, look, what happened to Daniel? And in the context, you can see the puzzlement in Belshazzar's face. And she said, well, your dad, Nebuchadnezzar, he used a guy, a wise man. He had the spirit of God. She doesn't understand the one and only true God. He has this spirit in him. He can interpret stuff. What happened to him? Where's he? Well, they go find him, of course. He is not evidently the head of the captains of Babylon anymore, right? We think about Daniel ascending and staying in a position of power, but it looks like in the reign of Belshazzar, he's been relegated to forgotten about, gone, back to maybe a very humble position, out of the spotlight, doing whatever. Belshazzar doesn't even seem to know who he is. The queen remembers, but they have to go find him. They get him. They bring him in. Of course, he interprets everything there upon the wall. How about what Daniel says to him? He gives the whole story. In verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. You know, I don't want all the gifts and stuff. I'm just going to tell you. But Daniel takes upon himself to condemn the king. He says he gives the story of Nebuchadnezzar, verse 20. When Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up, his mind hardened, he was deposed from his throne. They took the glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made as beast. Remember that? Nebuchadnezzar was driven out as a wild man who lived out in the fields and out in the woods for a while before God gave him his kingdom back. And Daniel's rehearsing history for him. I'm going to say this. Isn't it good to hear real history and not revisionist history? You know, Daniel's reminding him of what really happened and how this really played out. I'm sure that's a part of Nebuchadnezzar's life they didn't want to talk about. You know, we don't talk about those months when, Dad was out there living like an animal. Don't talk about that. Daniel's like, well, this is what happened. He forgot God. He vaulted himself up in pride. God drove him out there, and then God gave him his kingdom back. He says over in verse 22, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, you have not humbled thine heart, though you knewest all this. He's like, this was common knowledge, and you could have studied it. You should have known it. It happened to your own father, but you didn't humble your heart either. And look where you're at. And Daniel begins to give him the interpretation. And we know that very night, his kingdom is gone and his life is over. The answer to this is within hours. Chapter 7, Daniel prays. And Daniel's given a vision as he prays. And verse number 1 tells us he had a dream and visions upon his bed. He wrote the dream and told us some of the matters. And if you read down through it, it sounds like you're reading the book of Revelation, different beasts, different gates, different things like that. And so we're going to jump ahead to verse 16, chapter 7. I came near unto one of them that stood by. I asked him the truth of all this, so he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. Yet again, Daniel is given a picture, a vision, something different of things to come and what might be happening, and he's given the answer to it. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. Verse 1, and then we're going to jump ahead. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel. After that which appeared unto me at the first, I saw a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was in Shushan, the palace. All right, jump ahead to verse 15. It came to pass, so I'm in chapter 8, verse 15. It came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. All right, let me just summarize real quick. Yet again, Daniel is given some information. He's not sure how to interpret it. He's not sure what to do with it. He's looking for the answer of it. How about this for an answer to prayer? All right, this is why I have Daniel established today as our example of someone who knew how to get a hold of God. Ready? Daniel was given some information. He didn't know what it meant. He prayed and asked God, what's the answer of this? What's the sum of this? What does this mean? And the voice of God could be heard as God said to the archangel Gabriel, Gabriel, tell this man what it means. How about that for a prayer life? Talk about having your prayers answered. Talk about having your prayers answered in an extraordinary way, and talk about having your prayer answered like right away. So Gabriel the archangel, I understand these are unique times, and we're in the church age now. I understand that. But look at the power of the man Daniel, living in Babylon, in a godless city. Again, without a church family, or without a synagogue family, or without any spiritual support. Who does he talk to? Where does he go? He's a politician. He came down to Babylon as a young person, as a young man. He could have been impressionable. He could have been swayed and just accepted the Babylonian lifestyle. He had moved himself up. He had done very well as far as earthly success in establishing himself and putting himself in a good position and making a lot of money. He could have just said, with that Jewish God, that was something we did as a kid. But he didn't. He kept his faith strong in spite of these circumstances. And as he prayed, he said, God, I don't know what it is you're trying to tell me. Would you explain it to me? And God Almighty says, Gabriel, help the man out. And Gabriel begins to explain all that he had seen and all that he had done. Let's look at one more, chapter 9. Chapter 9. I preached on this on a patriotic day a couple years ago. Memorial Day or July 4th, one of those type of weekends, I preached on this. And I just think what Daniel did in chapter 9 is so important. I'm not going to gloss over it. In chapter 9, Daniel prays for his country. He's concerned about it. Verse 2, in the 1st year of his reign, that's Darius, verse 1. In the 1st year of Darius' reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So I set my face upon the Lord to seek by prayer and supplication with fasting and sackcloth and ashes, and I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him, to them that have kept his commandments. Verse 5, we have sinned and have committed iniquity. You'll see that all down through chapter number 9, the first half of the chapter. Here's where Daniel's at. Number 1, we see he's a student of the scriptures. because he's been studying the book of Jeremiah. And he's understanding the prophecy of Jeremiah, and that is that God promised Jeremiah and the people that they would be restored. They would go into captivity, but they'd be able to come back. And here's Daniel in captivity, in the middle of that fulfillment of prophecy, saying, all right, God, when do our people go back? When? And so Daniel, listen, I think he takes an awful lot of responsibility upon his shoulders. I don't know who else is spiritual at this time, but there's not too many. And I dare say in Babylon, there's hardly any. And Daniel goes before God and says, God, it's time for us to go home. God, answer my prayer. God, this is what Daniel does, ready? I will make confession for my people. I am convinced in America today that we are consumed with this idea that the world is terrible and the world is far from God. And boy, do they need Jesus out there. They do. Daniel sat there and said, you know what? I'm an Israelite, and we messed up. Listen, we know the story. Daniel didn't do it. Right? Did Daniel personally abandon God? Did Daniel personally walk away from God? Did Daniel personally, in his life, follow false gods and disobey God's commandment? No, to the contrary. Daniel may have been the only spiritual person left, not literally, but we don't have record of too many. And Daniel had such a prayer life that Daniel said, I'm going to take upon myself to pray in forgiveness of the sins of all of our people. Daniel said, we sinned. We've committed trespass. We've walked away. God, forgive us. Do you wonder about the throne of heaven? As God looks down and sees Daniel praying that? Where's the rest of them? Where's all the other ones that literally walked away from God? You know what? They didn't care, but Daniel cared. Our country is not going to turn around if the world gets right with God. Our country will get turned around when the Christians say, God, forgive us. Me. Us. The church. It has to start here. It doesn't start here by making a difference out there. It starts here by making a difference in here. If the church gets right in here, then things will change out there. But we have got, Daniel set such an example of this. Now listen, at the end of that prayer, when Daniel is asking forgiveness for his people, for his country, for his time, God, restore us. I remember your prophecy in Jeremiah. Restore us as a people, he cries out. At the end of that, guess who we see? Verse 21. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of God. Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel came back, right? Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning. Being caused to fly swiftly, he touched me about the time of the evening oblation. He informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. Now, listen. Verse 23, verse 24, verse 25, verse 26 are some of the most important verses of prophecy that we have. These are verses that still, listen, so much of the prophecy in the Word of God has been fulfilled. That's how we know the Word of God is true, because so much of it was prophesied earlier in Scripture and fulfilled later in Scripture, but not all of it. We haven't written the last part of the book. And by that I mean we haven't fulfilled the last part of the book. It's written. We haven't fulfilled the last part of the book. And that is this. Gabriel's about to give Daniel a timeline. He's going to give him a timeline of when the Messiah will come, when the Messiah will die, and what's going to happen with the Antichrist. So some of these things are future for Daniel, for us, For Daniel, they're all future for Daniel. Some of them were fulfilled in Daniel, right after Daniel. They're past for us now. But some of them are still future for us, is what I'm trying to say. Some of them are still future for us. Some of this prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. And that is the things to come. Daniel was given a timeline. Listen, we're getting up to Christmas time. We get to Christmas time, you're going to see all over the place 3 wise men traveling from afar. We know this, right? The Bible says there's 3 gifts. Don't know how many wise men. 3 gifts. Group of wise men travel from afar. They're following a star. God has revealed to them that the Messiah should come. How did they know that the Messiah should come about right then? Well, because they had studied Daniel chapter 9. Because they knew these verses. They had studied the entirety of... Listen, remember when Herod said, what are they talking about? To his wise men? To his wise men? He said, these guys have traveled and are looking for this Jesus, this Messiah. What are they talking about? And his wise men said, well, it did say back in the Old Testament that, yeah. This prophecy was so important. Listen, Daniel is on his knees, praying for his country, praying for his people, asking forgiveness for his sin and the sin of his people. He took all that responsibility upon himself. And as he did that, Gabriel comes and says, all right, we're going to give you some answers. And he gives him a timeline. Listen, wouldn't it be nice to have that? Wouldn't it be nice to know exactly what might be happening over the next decades or something? Daniel had somewhat of a timeline. He knew when the Messiah would come and when the Messiah would be cut off and when the Antichrist would come and when he would commit blasphemy in the temple. He knew all those things. We still have that timeline to go by today. We're going to talk about some of that tonight in the midst of my evening lesson. But this prophecy in Daniel 9 is so important. All right, back to chapter 6. Back to chapter 6. I hope I established the fact that Daniel was a man of prayer. A man of prayer. Let's look at these things on the outline that I put up here for you. He had a program of prayer. We talked about that. He had a place of prayer. A literal, physical location where he got a hold of God. I think that's important to have. Right? If we wait to pray for a convenient place or time, it'll never happen. It'll happen rarely. Daniel had a place where he went to pray. It was scheduled. This was an important man. This was a guy, and I skipped over some of this, but after he interpreted the handwriting on the wall for Belshazzar, Belshazzar moved him back up in the importance of people. Here with Darius, he's a very influential, important person, one of the top men in the whole kingdom. Isn't it amazing? Daniel ascended to a position of authority in the reign of 3, 4, maybe more, history tells us, different kings, different empires. How does that happen? Because he had the power of God upon his life. In Daniel 6, what we see here is political backstabbing, right? It's exactly what happens in chapter 6. Other people are jealous of his position. Verse 2, over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts to them, the king should have no damage. This Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, so he's under the reign of Darius. Again, he's at the highest level. The whole king thought to set him over the whole realm. Think about that. The king's basically going to say, you know what, Daniel, why don't you run the place? I'm going on vacation. Right? I'm ready to retire. Me and the missus, we're going to go down the shore. You run the place. He's going to set him over the whole realm. He's going to put him in charge. Verse 4, so the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. What does that mean? They wanted power, right? This is political backstabbing. This is Washington, D.C. circa 2020, right? This is what goes on all the time in the back rooms as they try to get the power from each other and knock people out of position so they can have the authority and the power. And that's what they're doing. The king's like, Daniel, you're doing great. How about I just put you in charge? And all the other guys have a meltdown, right? It's like, wait, what about us? So we got to take care of it. We are going to sabotage Daniel's career. How are they going to do it? Middle of verse 4, but they could find none occasion nor fault. Stop right there. Isn't it great? He had no skeletons in that closet. They couldn't find anything. They couldn't find out about, weird messages he had sent, emails that he had sent, affairs that he had, relationships that went. He didn't have any of that stuff. There was no baggage. There was no problem. They couldn't find anything in his life. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So they said this, verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. We've got to do something because of his religion. We've got to take him down because he believes in the Almighty God. I'm telling you, it sounds like 2020. Verse 6, then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said, King Darius live forever. I'm going to stop right there. So they begin to write this statute, right, about nobody can ask anything except for the king. They're just trying to sabotage Daniel. They don't care about the king. They don't care about anything else but their own careers. Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. I'm going to stop right there. He went to the place that he always prayed. It gave us very specific details. He went into his house, up into his chamber, opened his windows, the one that faced Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day. That's where he prayed. That was his place of getting a hold of God. I'm going to reiterate this. Ready? He had no church to go to. He had no synagogue, no prayer meeting, no prayer chain, no prayer support group, no Bibles. He didn't have anything. He's by himself. So Daniel had a place that he got a hold of God. It was in front of this window, in this room, in this house, and no matter how busy he was, no matter he was so important, the king said, why don't you just run the whole realm? He's that busy, he's scheduled 3 times a day to pray. Famous quote from centuries ago as people asked the traveling evangelist John Wesley. John Wesley would often start his day with about 3 hours of prayer every day. And the famous quote was someone came up to him and said, John Wesley, I admire you for praying like that. He's like, because of my position, I'm just too busy. I don't have time to pray for 3 hours a day. And John Wesley said, I'm so busy, I can't afford to not pray 3 hours a day. That's a guy who turned the world upside down. That's a guy who turned his country upside down. That's a guy who started the great denomination and did all the great things. He saw many come to the Lord. He started with a time and a place and a purpose of prayer. Daniel had a place of prayer. He had a priority of prayer. I stopped where I read on purpose. I left off the last line. We see this line a few times in Scripture, and I think it's one of the most important lines we see in relation to the character of people. At the end of verse 10, he gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime, which means what? He had a priority in prayer. This is what he always did. This is where he always was. And we know this, and again, I'm running out of time here, but we know he always did this because his enemies came looking, right? They're like, oh, look, it's almost 6 o'clock, about time. Daniel, throw open them windows, and he'll start praying, and we'll get him. They knew where to look, when to look. Why? Because he always prayed like that. It wasn't new. It wasn't Daniel in the midst of a crisis. It wasn't Daniel going, oh boy, this king just signed a really tough decree. I don't know what I'm going to do. I better go pray about it. No, this was Daniel going, wait, it's that time of day. I always pray at this place and this time in this way. And he went and began to pray. And I don't want to just gloss over the fact at the end of verse 10, it says, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and what? Gave thanks. Gave thanks. We always see that in Daniel's prayer life. That's why, again, I think he's such an important example of prayer. He thanked God. He thanked God. I think we need to do more of that. We talked about this in prayer meeting a couple weeks ago. I updated our prayer sheet that we use in prayer meeting on Wednesday night. it doesn't just have prayer requests anymore. It also has answers to prayer and praises on one side. Because it's high time we don't just ask, but we also think and acknowledge who is answering the prayer. Daniel did that. He had a priority for prayer. And then we know his power in prayer. And look, long story short, this is one of the most important and well-known Bible stories in all of Scripture because Daniel was cast into the lion's den. And what happens? Well, he comes out the next day, right? The lions are suddenly not hungry that night. The Bible tells us God closed the mouth of the lions. But I want you to see this. I started with this with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to see it again with Darius. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Verse 20. Verse 20. Verse 20, when he came, the king rose very early, verse 19. When he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, notice the big G, that's important, right? This is telling us that the person who is speaking acknowledges the one and only true God, not just a God. O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? And Daniel said unto the king, my God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths. I jumped over, and I meant to mention this in context here. Go up to verse 16, just to see the heart of the king. Verse 16. Before he got thrown in, the king commanded, and they brought Daniel, they cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake, and he said unto Daniel, these are his last words to Daniel, thy God, whom thou servest continually, he'll deliver thee. Look at the faith of the ungodly king. The guy who wrote the decree, the king of the land, who's having him thrown into the lion's den, not willingly, but he'd been tricked and bamboozled into doing it. Now he has got to throw. So he goes and meets with him, and his last words to Daniel are not, I'm sorry this happened. You've been a good employee. You've been a good servant. You've been wronged. I'm sorry this happened. I'll take care of, family, and we'll let people know. And no. The king says, you know what I think? I think your God, who you have served continually, I think he'll see you out of there. Wow. Look at the character of the man Daniel. The impact he had on those around him, his co-workers, the king of the land, who knew that Daniel, we talked about this, Daniel served at least 4 other kings, at least 4 kings total in his life, at least. And there may have been some others in between there, history tells us. But at least 4 that we have record of, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus, Darius. We have some kings here who he had served. And Darius says to him, I know you've worked for a lot of other kings, but you served your God continuously. In other words, the real king that you serve has never changed. Earthly kings, Darius is acknowledging this, earthly kings have come and gone. But you've kept serving your God, and I think your God can get you out of this. Wow. What faith. What faith from a man who we have no reason to believe, up to this point at least, he was a believer in God. But he saw the faith in Daniel. There was power in Daniel's prayer life. And isn't it interesting the king came running back the next morning to check? Don't you find that interesting? Personally. He didn't send his assistant. He didn't send his armor bearer or whatever. Like, go check that for me. I'd like to know if he's okay. He goes himself. After not sleeping that night, he runs and finds and looks in and he says, was your God able? And Daniel says, my God is able to deliver me. Power and prayer. Listen, Daniel had a prayer life, and I just wanted to use as an example because we saw how he got a hold of God, but he didn't have a lot of resources to lean back on, right? He didn't. He wasn't living in an era where he was continuously filled with the Holy Spirit, like we are in the church age. He didn't have a church family. We talked about that. He didn't have the entirety of Scripture like we have today. God gave him some special things. He did. Gabriel himself came to answer some of his questions and answer some of his prayers. He did. But Daniel was living day to day in a godless society, far from the historical basis of his faith. And Daniel stayed faithful to God. Listen, I think we're in turbulent times. We are. Who knows what's going to happen in the days and months ahead? Political things, yes. Health things, evidently. The economy, I don't know. It looks like it could burst, right? What's happening? I don't know. Nobody seems to know. Where are we at? Daniel was in a very messy situation, and his prayer life was stronger than ever, and boy, did he need it. And he got answers to prayer. I hope we can learn a lot from Daniel. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we